Hey guys, what's happening? Welcome to the Your Forest Podcast. I'm Matthew Christoph. Today, I've got a really interesting podcast for you guys with Edward Struzik. He is a author, and he wrote a book called FIRESTORM, How Wildfire Will Shape Our Future. It's an excellent, excellent book. I read the whole thing cover to cover. It was incredible. It's so comprehensive. It got into some really serious issues, things I had never even considered. And it's not too jargony or anything like that. He did a really, really good job of making it available for everyone, from people who know nothing about wildfire to people who have a career in wildfire. Everyone can understand it and grasp the concepts that he's talking about. Very, like I said, very comprehensive. Really told a good story regarding climate change, regarding fire smart, fire wise. He talked about so many different issues. We go really in depth into it. I think you guys are really, really going to take something excellent away from this. He's a very well-spoken guy. Really did an excellent job with this book. I really recommend that you guys go out and check it out. Firestorm. Go buy it. As far as sponsors for today, we have Greenlink Forestry as well as Damaged Timber. Damaged Timber is the apparel company. They are providing a scholarship program for people going into environmental sciences, taking 10% of all the profit they get from their clothing and putting it towards the scholarship program. So if you guys want to support something that you believe in, like environmental sciences, helping people get out there and do the job that they want to do and get the education they want, you can buy hats and t-shirts and sweaters and toques from damagedtimber.com. Check it out on your at checkout. You put it YourForest10, the code YourForest10, you'll get 10% off on top of all that. So perfect. Check them out. Also, the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta is also a supporter of the podcast. Without any further ado, here is Edward and I. I guess I just wanted to get started with what caught your attention with wildfire and got you wanting to investigate it further and to the lengths that you did. Because I mean, in the book, you've gone to the Arctic, you've gone down to the States, you've gone over to the other side of the ocean, and I'm curious as to how this all got started in your mind.
Well, living in Alberta, you're always subjected to smoke and to the news about wildfire. I mean, I've lived here over 30 plus years, 35 years now, and in the days when I was a newspaper journalist, I covered the occasional fire, and they intrigued me, and so it just happened to be the 2003 fire season that I had chose to try to look at this more in depth, and I got myself hooked up with a Parks Canada crew that was fighting the Kootenay fires. Okay. At that time, and it seemed at that time pretty much all of the West was burning. It was really an intense fire season. And I watched that unfold and saw just how close that fire got to jumping into Banff, where it would have, marched all the way to the town site. Inevitably, I think they wouldn't have been able to stop it at that point because there's just no anchor, in between Kootenay and Banff. There's just nonstop forest. Yeah. And it was a bold move that these fire managers made, which I think could have ended them either losing their jobs or getting demoted. And I realized, wow, that's an incredible story. And at the end of that fire season, Rob Walker, who is now with the city of Victoria, told me that he thought that was a harbinger of the kind of fires that were going to come. And as each year unfolded and it seemed to be becoming more and more intense, I had this idea maybe there's a book in it. And so 2 years before this book was released, I pitched the idea to my publisher.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
that's a pretty quick turnaround. 2 years to get all this information together.
It was actually even probably a little less because I started before for the Fort McMurray fire, and then when the Fort McMurray fire occurred and garnered worldwide attention, my publisher in Washington D.C. called up and said, do you think you can get this book out quicker? Because we think that it's, incredibly timely. And so I basically dropped everything else that I was doing and then got the book done probably in a year, did a heck of a lot of traveling.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
That was one of the things I was going to ask. It sounds like you don't spend a whole lot of time at home. You're always abroad, seeing other places and following researchers around.
It's always been, it's been that way since, in the past 35 years, is that I usually embed myself in with a group of scientists, whether it's in the high Arctic, or in Siberia, or any place in the world, and spend as much time with them as I can, sometimes doing what they do, assisting in the field to really get a sense of what actually they're confronted with. And so I do an awful lot of traveling, and it kind of worked out with it was never the plan originally was that I like to do a lot of outdoor stuff, hiking and canoeing and whatnot, climbing. And I found this was a way of getting me to really remote, exotic places that I wouldn't ordinarily be able to get to.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I definitely found myself being a little bit envious reading of all the places you've been up in the high Arctic and everywhere, right? Like you're over by Chernobyl and you were by a bunch of mine sites and all kinds of crazy stuff. So, no, I found it intriguing for sure. I was wondering where you found the time to do it all. So, and write a book.
I get paid for it.
Get paid for it. Yeah. No, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I guess I was going through my notes as I was reading your book, trying to come up with where to focus and kind of what questions to draw, because I had a million different things I wanted to get through, right? And to dumb it all down to an hour, it'll be tough. But I guess one of the some of the interesting things right off the bat were you discussed pyrocumulonimbus driven lightning.
Yeah.
So the idea that fires get big enough that they will drive their own weather, essentially, right? And personally, I think I've come across it once. I was a hell attack firefighter for 3 seasons, actually during when Slave Lake burned. I'm from Slave Lake too, so that was interesting. But I saw it once, and I didn't know myself if that's exactly what it was. It sure seemed like it. I kind of hypothesized that's what it was, but I never looked into it after that. So it's just a fascinating idea that a fire can get to a point where it can drive its own weather and its own lightning and create more fires further ahead, right? And it was very interesting to read you talking about, or read you writing about it. Anyways, yeah.
I found it absolutely astounding. I knew about it vaguely before I started writing the book, and then when I began to investigate it more closely, I was stunned by just how powerful, how much energy is produced by these really big, intense fires. And it was the person that really, there were 2 people that, as they say, blew my mind when talking about this. One was Cordy Timstra, who works as fire scientist for the Alberta government. Mm-hmm. He told me in confidence during the Fort McMurray fire that lightning caused by that the Pyro CB had triggered fires 34 kilometers in advance of the fire. And he said he had never, heard anything like this and searched the literature and never found anything analogous to this. And then I just happened to stumble upon a scientist, meteorologist working for the U.S. Naval Defense Lab in Washington, D.C. or in Virginia, who had also been looking at this. And what he told me also fascinated me was that part of his job was to look at, things that happen in the stratosphere and the troposphere. And there was always this theory that the energy from these fires can only go so high into the atmosphere. And so using satellite data, he started seeing some weird clouds in the summertime that weren't supposed to be there. And then he would report back, and everybody dismissed it as, well, it's just probably from a volcano. And he was perplexed because he could find no evidence that there was a volcano that exploded around that time. And he'd keep going back and telling people that, it's not a volcano. And they just refused to believe that it was anything other than a volcano until he finally went to Brian Stocks from the Canadian Forest Service that was purposely lighting fires in Ontario in the 1980s to see, just how intensely they burn, and told them, how high can these, these pyro-CBs go, smoke from these pyro-CBs go? And he said, 35,000 feet in the air at least. And he realized then that these pulses, can get that fire, break through the troposphere and then circle the globe twice. And so now he's kind of involved in a new paradigm of science.
Yeah.
Tracking pyro-CBs. And apparently he told me that the fires in BC, there was a pyro-CB from the fires in BC this summer that was the mother of all pyro-CBs.
Oh,
I'm
really?
waiting to hear, when they publish the paper, just how intense that one was.
Yeah, I wonder if like when places like, say we're in Alberta, we're in Edmonton, obviously, if you get a fire from the Yukon blowing smoke into here or something, would it have to get into the stratosphere to get here, or could it stay in the troposphere to travel that far?
It can stay. It all depends, and I'm not sure I understand really the mode of transport, but I don't think that it has to go that high up.
Right.
We've had smoke from fires, going from Alaska and the Yukon all the way down to Houston, Texas. And we know that once they get that high up, they can actually circle the globe twice.
Like the Chisholm fire, you were saying, the Chisholm fire up by Slave Lake. I remember that fire. We weren't evacuated from school, but I remember being pulled out of school and coming out, and there was just this orange haze, and there's ash falling down. Right now, I was 11 years old, right?
Yeah,
and it blew my mind reading your book talking about the Chisholm fire, how that had become a pyro-CB high enough to break through the troposphere into the stratosphere and circle the globe twice. Like, that's the implications of that are crazy. So like on with that subject, you discussed polar bears actually getting fatter as a result of something like this happening.
Yeah, I mean, and the analogous situation is the volcano, the Mount Pinatubo, which erupted in the early 1990s. It lowered the temperature of the Earth by a degree and a half. I can't remember the exact figure,
which is amazing. Just by just sheltering it from the sun, right?
I remember this distinctly because my wife and I were canoeing, doing a first descent down the Kujawa River in the high Arctic on Victoria Island that summer, and we've been canoeing the Arctic quite a bit. And 15 years earlier, I think I'd done 20 trips by then. And one thing you really notice about the Arctic summers is that they're generally they're dominated by high pressure systems, because at that time there was still a lot of ice reflecting whatever heat the sun brought down.
Right, it's bounced it back
up. And so these low pressure systems never really had a chance to kind of take hold in June and July. They'd have to wait until August when the open water sort of started to develop and absorbing that heat.
Right.
And so everything would be dominated by a high pressure system. And so we went, 15, 20 years, and we'd have the occasional, snowstorm, whatever. But generally speaking, we had some pretty nice warm weather dominating our 3-week, 6-week trips.
Right.
But we were on the Kujawa River, and it snowed every day. And I also remember at that time, we just saw, most of the geese just abandoned their nests at that point.
Right.
It just wasn't, there just wasn't enough heat for them to be able to lay their eggs and feed them. And as it turned out, that year there was a study done that I think that 75% of the observed nesting areas in the Arctic failed that year because of the extreme cold.
Because of the pyro-CBs, because of the smoke and the
volcano.
So
the question is will at some point, these fires, if we have enough of them burning, lower the Earth's temperature? Probably not. It'll be probably much more localized, the impact. But I think the more important point is that, we're getting a lot of particulates flying around. And in those particulates, there are a lot of things that we probably shouldn't be breathing, because this is the other thing that I didn't know was that smoke from a wildfire has pretty much all of the same toxins that you have in tobacco smoke.
Isn't that crazy? I didn't know that either, actually, when you mentioned that in the book.
I did. I didn't know it, and I just came across a a couple of studies that weren't actually linked, but I saw, all of the things that you find in wood smoke. And then I looked at what do you find in tobacco smoke, and the crossover was remarkable.
Really?
And some of the worst, cadmium, mercury, those were all present.
So what's the crossover, do you think, between those two? Is there like 50%? Or?
I would say about 80-90%.
Really, that much?
Yeah,
so just
80-90%.
Missing the nicotine, basically.
Yeah, you're looking at 650 different toxins or chemicals, and there's I would say easily 80%
right
crossover.
I would imagine different concentrations of them all, but still, it's there, it's
right.
present.
Yeah. But with wood smoke, I think probably the more dangerous part of it is the particulates that you have that are that you wouldn't get in tobacco smoke. Is that if they're large enough, they really can damage the lungs, and they can create a lot of problems for people with asthma.
Yep. Yeah, no, that makes sense. It becomes similar to asbestos at some point, right? It's just small particulate matter in the lungs, causing irritation and all kinds of different things. Yeah. No, that was like I said. Every time I turned a page in your book, I was going, "What the hell? How did I not know some of this stuff?" Right? Like it's wild to think about. So we talked. Yeah, we're coming right along here with pyrocumulonimbus clouds, and the polar bear thing really blew my mind. The fact that it cooled down the Arctic long enough for an extra 3 weeks or whatever it was to keep ice longer, so that polar bears could hunt longer.
That's right.
So like it just from that was from the Chisholm fire, am I right? Or that was from a different?
No, it was from the Mount Pinatubo.
That was the volcano.
And the scientist that discovered this was Ian Sterling, who was the Canadian Wildlife Service based in Edmonton. And he was tracking polar bears since the early 1980s, and there was a suspected link between warming and thinning polar bears. And in this case, it was 1992 or 1993. Suddenly, the bears just got really fat, and he couldn't quite figure out why did they suddenly get very fat on the coast of Western Hudson Bay. And that's when they came up with the link. Was that they knew that the season lasted a couple of weeks longer, 3 weeks longer. There was a lot of seals to be hunted, and the bears just had more time to put on a lot of fat.
Yeah,
and then someone had the eureka moment: is why did we have such a long winter? Well, Mount Pinatubo decreased the world's temperature by about 1 degree, and that's just enough in the Arctic, where everything's amplified, to make a summer season last a couple of, and that's why in the Arctic, 2 or 3 degrees warming is just kind of like a stick of dynamite on a forest.
Yeah,
because it creates more lightning, more drought-like conditions. It dries things out, and so you've got this vast. I don't know if you've ever been to the boreal forest of the subarctic. It just goes on forever.
Yeah, no, exactly, and with that, you put on top of that climate change doing the same thing, right? You have climate change increasing the temperature, so you have longer fire seasons, we're drier, we have more lightning from evaporation, and so more opportunity for lightning. All these things, and then as you pointed out as well, we have more people working and living and recreating in the forest, and more every year, right? It only becomes a larger issue, I suppose. Yeah, you called it an insurmountable challenge. It does seem like that for sure. There's a lot of nobody really knows where to go with some of these decisions, I guess, right?
Yeah, insurmountable may be an extreme way of describing it. Because I don't think we're ever going to solve, the challenge of wildfire, but I think there's a heck of a lot, we can do to mitigate what we're going to be facing in the future. The problem is that I don't think we're doing enough to really keep up with this new paradigm that's unfolding. And you hear about it all the time. Communities, coastal communities, spending now billions of dollars trying to prepare themselves for rising sea levels. You have coastal communities like Tofino, which have tsunami alerts, wake people up in the middle of the night as they did last month when there was a threat of a tsunami. Everybody, got into their cars at 2 a.m. and then went to the community center, which is on high ground. We have that for hurricanes and tornadoes. We even adapt for avalanches. We've got people up in helicopters dropping sticks of dynamite, to trigger an avalanche so that people won't get hurt. And I think that in the world of wildfire, we really haven't got to that point yet. We don't have an evacuation plan, for example.
Yeah.
I don't know of any town in Canada that has really advanced an evacuation plan where people know exactly where to go if there's a fire in the middle of the night, whether be it Banff or where I'm going to Whitehorse this week. If there's a fire, it could be like what happened in Oakland, California in 1991, where suddenly people are driving along the highway through a forest and there's fire, they're abandoning their cars, and some people are running into the fire because they just don't know where to go.
Yeah, they're surrounded by it. Yeah, no, it can be it really looks, if you're not used to seeing wildfires in all their glory, when they're crowning and they're flying through the tops of the trees, it can be extremely intimidating for sure. And,
I had this experience in about 10 or 12 years ago. I was doing a solo kayaking trip down the Nahanni, Liard, and Mackenzie rivers, and I was on the river for 66 days. Those rivers are 66 days on my own. And there was one day I got around beyond Norman Wells, and suddenly the sky just blackened, and then I got the big smell of smoke, and I thought, God, the forest is on fire. And I was trying to figure out, well, which side of the river should I be on? I had a satellite phone. I called my wife, who called a friend, who called the RCMP. The RCMP called the forestry people up in the Northwest Territories. And within 10 minutes or 15 minutes, they told me, you're all right. Doesn't matter what side of the river you're on. That fire's a long, long way away. But I can tell you, it was just horrifying, because it was 1 minute it was just blue skies, and the next minute it was black, and I was, choking from this acrid smoke. It was just coming down like fog down the river, except that it was just carbon, airborne carbon, and it was horrifying. I just didn't know what to do. And fortunately, I had the satellite telephone that be able to tell me, find the information I needed. And I think that most, when you're living in a city, what routes do you take? People in Fort McMurray told me that, some neighbors told them, don't go down this way because their houses are catching fire there. And everything worked out, almost miraculously in favor of public safety in that case.
Yep.
So much more could have gone wrong.
Oh yeah.
And it truly is, I think, a miracle that it didn't end up even worse than it was, terrible as it was.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're right. I think most likely the only cities or towns that I know that have a good evacuation plan now, I would say, is probably Fort McMurray and Slave Lake, considering they went through it, right? Like and even then, I don't know for sure. I'm just assuming that, they would have sorted it out at this point. But yeah, it's one of those things that I remember when Slave Lake happened, getting calls from my wife who was in Slave Lake. I was out of town. I wasn't working yet, but I showed up the day after it burned down, actually, and started working again for wildland firefighting. But talking to people, to my coworkers after I got back, asking them what it was like while the town was being overtaken and stuff, and and then who was running what, who called for the evacuation, all that stuff, and it was confusion because nobody had really, on all lines, really knew who was in charge in the city. Was it the mayor? Was it the fire department? Was it the government? No one really knew, right? I think it was just confusion, and they were trying to sort it out as best they could, and they did it. I think they did the best job they could have done. But yeah, I think now that we're starting to see these kind of destructive fires coming into towns and villages and stuff, there definitely needs to be some plans in place in case this happens. And I think Fort McMurray kind of exposed that.
Yeah, and I think the chain of command has got to be very clear. There's got to be just one decision-making body rather than two, the province or the county. It can't be quibbling back and forth about, what do we do next? And I think there's got to be lines drawn in the sand to say, at what point do we evacuate? We can trust meteorological forecasts up to a certain point. with a fire, there's so much energy there that fire, as they say, it kind of had a mind of its own, and it surprised people by the way it moved. So is it 6 kilometers away from a community, 8, 10? I don't even think that we really know.
No.
But at some point, you got to you really basically have to make a decision. If it gets this close, evacuate. Mm-hmm. And schools should have a plan in place. Where do you take the kids? And how do you inform the parents about where you're going to take the kids? What do you do with people in the hospitals? What do you do with people in old age homes? Maybe those people are the first that should go, because it takes so much, time to move, the vulnerable.
Yeah.
But I think that's got to be thought out well ahead of time. And we just haven't done that with, wildfire management up to this point. Like I said, I talked to people in Tofino about being woken up in the middle of the night to a false alarm.
Oh, right, yeah.
Most of them shrugged their shoulders. It was kind of fun, and it was a pain in the ass to have to wake up at 2. But then you go to the community center and you see everybody and you're chatting away, and then they say, okay, no, it's no problem. You can all go home. And I think there was just everybody was kind of reassured that at least we got a plan.
Yeah.
And so, if one really does come along, this is what we do. And there were some hiccups here and there, but generally speaking, I think it went well.
Yeah.
That's what we got to do with wildfire, I think.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. And I think any fire management person or anyone in the fire community industry and that in profession would agree with you. And they'd say that, yeah, there's things that we never thought about and we need to sort them out because, it's going to become more and more common, I would imagine. And I imagine it's difficult for decision makers, people like, say, worried about shutting down the economic activity in a town for a couple of days because, there's fires happening, right? Where people just kind of think, it's easy to think, it won't happen here, right? It's not, it's unlikely. Like, they'll stop it. It's 10 kilometers away. Like, it's fine. But you're, like you said, you can't control those things, right?
Yeah.
Those fires, once they get up and roaring and they're moving, you're just waiting on rain. You're kind of, you can steer it kind of with aircraft and that, but realistically it's going whatever direction the wind is pushing it. And
it's interesting that the oil sands companies like Suncor and Syncrude hired their own fire experts at that time because they weren't, trustful 100% of what they would be getting from people who were actually involved in the firefighting. Not because they distrusted their expertise. It's just that it became, a firefighting effort for save the town of Fort McMurray. And they just needed some reassurance because they've got, a multi-billion dollars worth of assets that they've got to protect and people that they've got to protect. Mm-hmm. And if they're going to shut it down, it takes a while to shut things down. And then it takes quite a bit of while to get things back going. So, they can lose billions of dollars as a result. And I think, they're probably, I'm not privy to what they're doing, but I'm sure that they're probably doing more than the province. And I don't want to, focus on Alberta because I think Alberta is probably one of the leaders, in wildfire management. But I think that it's just it's endemic to the entire, forested world that we still don't look at fire as a manifestation of weather like we do with tsunamis, with avalanches, with hurricanes and tornadoes. Yeah. We all, have that kid's view that the fire trucks will come and put things out.
Yeah.
And and most people in the world of wildfire management know that, no, we can't do that. Once a fire gets beyond 100 hectares, and if the winds are going in, favorably in favor of the fire and the heat is there and the humidity is down, the only thing you can really do in that case is to slow it or steer it in another direction. And even that can be difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the misconception a lot of people have, right? They just think, well, why didn't you stop the fire before it hit the town? Or why, you know what I mean? And it's, it's not that easy, right? Like I describe the Slave Lake fire as a blowtorch. Like, the winds were 100 kilometers an hour. It was blowing right into town. It's like, you can't even fly. at 100 kilometers an hour. So you have no aircraft in the air, or whatever, right? Like it's chaos. So to try and pretend that we can stop something like that is just, all we can do is manage for it. And with programs like FireSmart or FireWise, and I think FireWise is what they have in the States, I think.
Yeah.
And similar to that we can try and mitigate some of those issues, and hopefully that becomes more common in some of these urban and wildland interface zones, right? But yeah, it's an insane issue to try and tackle, considering, like, as you pointed out in the book, there's 1,000 different sides to this problem, right? And to try and understand them all and manage them all it's a hell of a problem, that's for sure.
It is, but we compare it. Like this morning on CBC, there was the mayor of Surrey, BC, talking about how rising sea levels, even just a few millimeters, how it's really going to impact that community. And they've got a plan afoot. They've already come up with a plan. It's about a $1.5 billion plan to try to, deal with that. The question was asked, well, that's a hell of a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
But I think her response was perfect in that, but the cost of not dealing with it is going to be, hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah.
And, so they're looking at it in a realistic way. And I think that with fire management, it doesn't have to be all that expensive right now. And I think that, industry and scientists and government can work together to come up with plans. It's an investment in the future, and it's going to be a job creator. So, it's not like it's going to be sucking that money and putting it down the toilet. It actually, I think, will be beneficial in the long run. So it kickstarts local economies to some extent, and it also protects them in the long term, in the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just changing gears a little bit, talk more about kind of the state of the forest in relation to wildland fighting, or firefighting, sorry. And you mentioned in the book, and this is something that I always kind of suspected as a question kind of mulling over my mind. I never really had anybody to talk to about it. Regarding fire suppression, we know that fire suppression in the last 50, 60, 100 years we've stopped a lot of these fires from getting bigger and taking over like they would have, right? And you hypothesize in here that we had higher number of low intensity fires burning through, creating new room for vegetation to come up, whereas now, considering we suppressed for so long, we may be creating a situation where you have fewer number, larger, more intense, uncontrollable fires. And in relation to that, we're talking about old growth, and that perhaps now we might actually have an unnatural amount of old growth, or a higher average age of the forest relative to what is considered natural had we not been suppressing fire. I just wanted you to speak to that a little bit, because it's a question that I've had in my mind myself, and I'm not sure how much of it is true, how much of it is just hearsay. If we've mitigated some of that loss of fire with forest harvest, maybe that's helped a little bit to break the land up and provide that new growth and new habitat. I'm not really sure. It's just a kind of an open question in my mind.
Yeah, and I don't think there's, one size fits all here. But, if you look at the examples in, say, Jasper, Banff, Yellowstone, Yosemite, places like that, where there was, consistent, aggressive attempts to stop fires from burning, it's very clear that if you look at the pictures from the last century, early last century, and the pictures now of the same places, that, Jasper had a lot less forest. Banff had a lot less forest.
What were those pictures at the book opening that you had up? I'd seen them before, and it was taken from the top of a mountain in 1900, I think, or something, early 1900s, and it was just clearly right after a forest fire, and it was all bare earth and some stems sticking up. And then there was another picture from recently, and it was all forest.
I think that was photos taken by Cliff White from Parks Canada of Sulphur Mountain. He was comparing the photos that he's taken in recent years to photos that were taken back in, I think, 1910 or whatever. And you really do see that, that fire made a big imprint on the landscape back then.
Yeah.
And part of the reason was that, we didn't fight fires, but we also kicked out people who started fires, like First Nations people started fires. And I was fascinated by this, because I was reading a lot of literature about, for the missionaries, for example, who would just go crazy because they considered these people pyromaniacs. Why would you want to burn down this beautiful forest and turn it into, and, the explanation wasn't good enough that, it produces, new berry crops. It opens up the land to, elk and deer and moose and bison, and it just makes it easier for their lifestyle. And even that, with that explanation, it never really got into anybody's head. Fire's bad.
Yeah, that was the mentality.
Yeah, and Native people, First Nations people were primitive, and so you really couldn't trust what they were doing. So we kicked them out of the national parks. I mean, I think this is not a lot of people know this, but people who frequented or lived in Jasper and Banff and Yosemite and Yellowstone and many other national parks, once those parks were up and running, those people got a visit from somebody from the Canadian or U.S. government, and in some cases cut them a check, told them, we're buying your land, and there's no choice on your part. You got to get out.
Yeah, and it's an eviction, not really a purchase.
It was really an eviction with some compensation, and so what happened until about really up until Yellowstone burned in 1988, the philosophy is that we fight, all fires. And I think Yellowstone proved, as much as it burned the park, that forests recover quite nicely from fires, and wildlife really benefits well from fires. So it's not such a terrible thing.
Yeah.
I think old growth forests have a role to play in ecosystems, and I think that in some places probably we need to protect them because we have carved up the land so much that those species, caribou and various forms of owls, really need an old growth forest if they're going to have a future. So I think that's part of a management plan, that we can sustain. I mean, it's we can, and I know that they do this in Alaska, is that in order to protect caribou now, is that caribou have almost as much protective status in a firefighting situation. It was remarkable because people identified caribou as such an important economic resource for them. It puts food on the table.
Right.
Populations are declining, so that if fire burns in a lichen-rich old-growth forest, and the resources are there, the U.S. Forest Service, the Alaska Forest Service, comes in and tries their best to put out the fire. Yeah.
No, it's fascinating to think of all these different types of issues that are at play. Like I know in Alberta we're only just kind of starting to get our hand on the pulse of the caribou situation, and it's a big issue. Nobody's really sure 100% what's going to work, what's not going to work, what the right thing to do is. And it's a very sensitive issue for sure. And with fire being another big player on the landscape, a lot of people are saying things like, well, what do we do when we protect this giant area and turn it into a park or something for caribou, and then the whole thing burns? Then what, right? And that's happened. For example, you mentioned near the end of the book about in Wood Buffalo National Park how almost half of the forest had burnt there and driven some of the bison out of the park.
That's the Mackenzie Bison Sanctuary.
Oh, Mackenzie. Okay, sorry, getting confused.
Yeah, in the Northwest Territories, just north west of Wood Buffalo.
Right. So and so things like that do happen, but at the same time we can't worry about what may or may not happen. We have to try and do what we know right now to help these species persist, right? So
and I think the caribou is a classic example of having waited so long and dithered for so long that our options now are extremely limited. I can remember my first aerial survey of caribou in 1981. It was with a provincial government biologist by the name of Jan Edmonds, and it was over Wilmore, Jasper. And I remember her saying to me at that time is that if we don't start doing something to protect these babies, they're going to be gone.
Yep.
And she was right. I mean, we've dithered on this for so long that the choices were a lot easier back then because there's a lot more forests, there are a lot more options, there are a lot less oil and gas operations, timber operations, people living in those environments at the time. And now our choices are a lot more limited because there are few caribou and there are a lot more oil and gas operations and forestry operations and people living in those landscapes. And so it's almost an impossible situation for, scientists to solve this problem. We've had some scientists say that we probably might have to just get into triage mode, is that let some of these caribou populations, which are so low, just admit that we can't save them. We wouldn't have to say that kind of thing 30 years ago. But now that they're saying it suggests that here's the penalty that we pay for procrastinating for so long. And I think that, with the wildfire situation, the longer we stay with the status quo, the fewer options we will have in the future. We will probably just be spending all of our resources just trying to protect communities rather than investing in fire scientists and trying to maybe prescribe burns or in some cases thinning forest. It'll get away on us.
No, absolutely. It's an issue that I've already had 3 separate podcasts regarding caribou, and I want to have more because it's so just trying to get down to what should we do is, and that's the one thing that I've heard lots is it might be time for triage mode, unfortunately. But I'm not the expert, so I'm not going to suggest it. But
no, but some experts are saying that. I know to the horror of some of their colleagues. But the reality is that governments have just refused to act on this, even though it's been made very clear this is a problem. I mean, we have had caribou disappear from Banff National Park. If you can imagine that, from a protected area. The last 7 caribou, I think, died in an avalanche in 2007 or 2008.
Protected yet heavily recreated area.
Recreated area. And maybe, it was at the southern limit of their range. Parks Canada had it in the back of their mind to try to maybe reintroduce some caribou from BC because they were much more plentiful at that time. But they dithered on this. And Jasper did the same. They had the deal going with the Calgary Zoo to try to, do a soft release of caribou. The Calgary Zoo got out of it for, reasons that I don't know. But now Parks Canada is scrambling to figure out, their population. I think Moline Lake, used to have a couple of 300 caribou is down to like 3. The Moline Lake area. It's
rough. They're a sensitive species for sure.
That's right. And so now, a reintroduction campaign is constrained by the fact that caribou are scarce everywhere. We don't have a surplus of caribou on the landscape anymore.
No, absolutely. No, for sure. I could talk about this issue again. This will turn into a caribou podcast. I guess we'll move on. Moving on to some of the more really surprising things that, like I mentioned to you earlier, that totally caught me off guard regarding wildfire. Is you talked about going to Chernobyl and talking about radiation in regards to wildfires, as well as asbestos mines in relation to wildfire, arsenic from that was it's insecticide used for mountain pine beetle, ending up in the wood and that burning, that being released. So these are things that I never even considered, that the radiation from the Chernobyl accident would be in the vegetation and the trees, and that when it burned, it could be released. And same thing with the asbestos, by the asbestos mine, that could be released into the smoke and could go up into the stratosphere, and God knows where it's going to end up, right? So I don't know, maybe just like to speak to those issues a little bit, because it's not. I'm sure you've done quite a bit of research regarding it. It's just a fascinating topic that I've never even heard discussed before.
Yeah, the first I heard about it was when I went down to Libby, Montana, and I was actually just more interested in the transition zone between our boreal forest and their forests, which have, it's different forms, larch, which are much more fire resistant, trying to get a handle, as to how the different formulas for dealing with fire. And the Kootenai forest around Libby was a fascinating case study. And then I just happened to discover that through somebody from the U.S. Forest Service that they had a real crisis in place because their contract forest fires had all basically said that they would not fight a fire in the Kootenai forest around Libby because of this serendipitous discovery that the asbestos from the Libby plant, which had been operating for 75 years, had essentially these asbestos needles had embedded themselves into all the trees. And when they did this experimental study to see what would happen, because everybody heats their house with wood down that part of the world, what would happen if you burn that, what would happen to the asbestos? And they found that everything would turn to carbon, but the asbestos, being resistant to extreme heat, survived. And so in a plume, coming up from a wildfire, you'd have all of these needles going to come down someplace. And so the firefighters basically said, we're not going to fight that fire. And they had to bring in, I think FEMA's been involved, and now they have a permanent specialized team stationed there. And basically, for 8 months of the year, 9 months of the year during the fire season, that they know that they cannot let a fire like that get out of control. So they've got to be on it right away. So they're expending an enormous amount of money. And then shortly after, there was another study done about the forest around Chernobyl and how, they're radioactive. And when they burn, the radioactive material doesn't get destroyed. Mm-hmm. And I was fascinated by this because I had been to Chernobyl, and with a local doctor at the time who was part of a Chernobyl's Children's Project. And along the way, we were in the forest. We were taking readings with a Geiger counter, right, and getting this little hot spots all along the way. And that got me thinking about, well, what about all of these other mine sites in Canada? Thetford mines in Quebec, Clinton Creek in the Yukon, which, a lot of asbestos came out of there. Arsenic, that we use to spray a lot of forest. Arsenic that came out of the Giant Yellowknife mine. And everybody I talked to, I wasn't pointing fingers, although somebody from the Yukon government thought I was, and actually complained to Queen's University about me, and I had to do a lot of explaining. But most people looked at it rationally and said, we never thought of this before. And good point. And I've actually been invited to go to a Northern Contaminants workshop meeting in Toronto in June to talk about this, because I think that everybody suddenly realizes that this is something new that we haven't thought of. We always look at, how is it going to contaminate the water supplies in the area? So how do we shore up the groundwater, that may be passing through a contaminated site? But no one really considered what would happen if you had the forest around a contaminated site burning.
Yeah, it's a terrifying prospect. When I started reading through that, I was like, oh my God, how have we not thought about this? I'm sure there's lots of people who have thought of it, lots of scientists that have researched it, but I've never come across it.
Well, in fact, the people that at the Giant said that some of the scientists at the Giant Yellowknife mine told me that they'd never thought of it. I just posed it as a question. I mean, is it possible? And maybe it isn't a big problem. Right. Around some of these sites. Maybe it's not a Libby kind of situation where they actually know that, asbestos needles will survive a fire, and they will move around they can move around great distances. But I think this is something that we've got to kind of evaluate. And I know that people are starting to look at it and thinking that, all right, maybe this is, these are going to be priority zones in case there is a wildfire. Maybe we've got to start acting on this. And who knows? Maybe in the end that they'll find out is that arsenic in around the Giant Yellowknife mine and other places won't be a problem. Right. Maybe it will not be enough of a component in the wood burning smoke to be a serious matter. But right now we don't know. Right. We do know that mercury is a problem. Right. And that's why we've got limits on the number of fish we can eat in various places. It's because the mercury travels great distances.
Even out of the North Saskatchewan here in Edmonton, it's only one. They say you can eat one fish a week is what they say.
I know, yeah.
It's like one fish a week. Okay, yeah, it's definitely concerning. It makes you not want to eat any of the fish, right? Like it's just.
I know, and I've always had problems with that. Is that how do you arrive at that? I mean, is every fish equal? In the aquatic system, or as we all know, is that the older fish accumulate a lot more of this stuff over a long period of time than the younger fish. So if you get an old fish that's been, maybe 60 or 70 years old, maybe eating that is not a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah, luckily nobody's eating sturgeon in Alberta, so that's good.
No.
Eating 150-year-old fish full of just solid piece of mercury, most likely. It's I don't even know where, like, the questions that come up in my mind with the asbestos, knowing for sure that that's an issue, right? And the radiation, we don't know. Arsenic, we don't know. But the asbestos, for sure, we know. I just imagine this piece of woodland going up, the asbestos going up into the clouds, into the stratosphere, ending up in whatever, in Europe somewhere, and people in Europe suing whoever's responsible for starting the fire over here, right? Like it just seems like so preposterous, but it's fascinating to think about. It's definitely a concerning issue for sure, and I'm surprised that it's only just coming up now. So it's definitely something I'm going to keep my eye on and try and learn more about it, because
and part of the problem is that we've reduced our investment in fire science, so much since the 1990s. Well, the Canadian Forest Service used to have 2,200 people working for them, and they had a number of different research stations across the country. We closed most of them down. Now we've got about 700 working for the Forest Service, and very few of them are actually working on fire. Most of them are working on drought-related issues and mountain pine beetle.
There's a lot of research being done for sure on lots of different issues. Yeah.
But on fire, compared to what we used to be a leader in the 1980s and early 1990s, Canada was a leader in the world. Our fire alert systems have been adopted by many other countries from around the world, but they need updating.
Yeah, the fire weather index as well.
Yeah. They need updating, and I think that because we're starting to see, not starting, we have seen fires behave in ways that now are confounding wildfire managers. Is that new models have got to come out that help them better predict what's going on.
Yeah,
it's analogous to what's happening, with sea ice in the Arctic. With receding sea ice, you've got all kinds of opportunities coming up for shipping companies to exploit those passages. Yes. So China just announced that they're going to do it. But at the same time, it doesn't mean the ice is going to go away. In fact, you're probably going to have more ice moving because thinner ice breaks up more quickly. And, we've seen examples where, shipping companies have had to cancel journeys through the Arctic because no one is able to predict the ice within more than 7 or 8 days.
Yeah.
They need better models, and a lot of money is being invested in creating better models to help these companies that want to exploit those Arctic sea routes, so that they can navigate safely. Right now, they can't really do it beyond, say, 5 or 6 days.
Yeah, no, that's a whole other issue in itself too. Like tying into climate change and everything else, right? Like it's just, I saw an infographic today from, I think it was from NASA. I think they took a screenshot like 4 times a year or something of Arctic sea ice, and it was you just see the change in the depth of the sea ice and how it's breaking up and how it's becoming less, and it's thinner, and everything's kind of breaking up, and the impacts of that on weather and climate, and the way it's driving forest fires, and the way it all just seems to be a positive feedback loop. Every time you turn around, it's just everything's getting worse, right?
There's a correlation between receding years of where we have record levels of receding sea ice and the intensity and frequency of wildfires.
Yeah.
Because it releases a lot more heat into the atmosphere. It creates more cyclonic activity. And with cyclonic activity, you get more lightning.
Yeah.
And, so lightning, it causes only a third of the fires, but it's responsible for the biggest and most intense fires.
Yeah. The ones that are most remote and it takes a while to get to, so they have time to spread before you get to them. Yeah. I remember you, a number that you posted for the increase in lightning caused fires was something, or increase in lightning, I think it was 12% more lightning now than there was, I think, 20 years ago or something.
I think that's that. I'm not entirely sure of that figure, but I know that the projections are that it's going to double by mid-century.
Really?
And so let's use a few examples of the slow-moving storm that moved across Alaska in 2015. It produced almost no rain, but it shot out 65,000 bolts of lightning in a 5-day period and caused 237 wildfires. And that was, a near record year for them. It would have been a record year had August not come along with rain. Mm-hmm. But 65,000 bolts of lightning, 237 fires. We had, in 2004, what they thought was the worst lightning season up to then in the Yukon, Alaska. But it was I think about a third or a quarter of the number of lightning strikes. So if you kind of see those things happening, those events happening more frequently, mm-hmm. How do you deal with it?
Yeah, there's just more. Every time you turn around, every measurement you can take or look at, it just seems to be getting worse. It's just more likely that we're going to have more fires, larger fires, drier landscape, and just more severe everything, right?
Yeah. It's a game of Russian roulette in the sense that it used to be just one bullet in the chamber, but with each 5 or 10 years, we're putting another one and another one and another one. And so you can only dodge that bullet for so long that eventually it's going to catch up with you. And I've told this to people, in the city of Edmonton, and you look at our river valley, what's the plan for how would we deal if we had an intense lightning storm that passed through there, or say we had kids, that are having a little bonfire down the river on a hot night, everything's really tinder dry, and the wind blows in, and how do the firefighters get down there?
Or purposely lighting things.
Or purposely
People do that, especially kids, right? I remember doing that as a child. I had no idea what I was doing, right? Yeah. Just getting some grass and kind of putting it on the road and burning it just to see, because you're young and you want to see what's going to happen, the destructive power, right? So it's not unlikely in my mind that our river valley could easily burn at some point.
Well, when Fort McMurray burned in 2016, there was a fire that was started by kids in a playground in the West End, and the sparks from that fire traveled about, I think, a kilometer and burned a couple of houses with cedar shake shingle roofs. Yeah, but then you think about it, the sparks got into the river valley, and there was really windy that day. And I remember my wife and I really kind of got freaked out because we live overlooking the North Saskatchewan River. We have about 800 plus year old spruce trees, that the city has in front. We cross the street, the forest begins. Mm-hmm. My neighbor has a cedar shake shingle roof. Our house is a wood house built in 1941. My neighbor's house is a wood house built in 1941. Some of our neighbors are just surrounded by spruce trees. You think what was really needed is maybe the city sending out leaflets to people to make them aware that you are in a fire zone.
Yeah, but the people aren't going to cut down their spruce trees just for the in case. What I mean? For example, my parents in Slave Lake post. They've always kind of been fire smarting, or they live out in the country and fire smarting the area, and they have lots of balsam fir growing up in the understory, so it's prime for ladder fuel and driving a big fire, right? But they would go through and they'd cut down all the dead trees and they'd do everything they could. But I can't imagine the number of towering cedars people have stuff up against their house. I have one.
I'm too.
Yeah. And you're not going to cut it down. You're just if it comes time, you see a fire coming, you're like, okay, I'm cutting that down. I'll drag it to the road and leave it or something, right? But
or you mean, I guess just from a personal point of view is that if I'm around, or my wife's around, we do have a plan, that if there's a fire threat, we water down those cedars as best we can.
Yeah.
And, so keep them from drying out. Yeah, but there's smaller things you can do. Is that that in Fort McMurray, in Kamloops, the houses that many of the houses that burn also had that the bark landscaping, that looks really pretty that goes up to the house. It's just like that. What's the string that the fuse that
yeah, I know. Yeah, for TNT. Or
it all just burned and came up to the house, caught the wood fence. The wood fence caught the.
So basically, just wood chips they had, and the wood chips were just
and maybe we alert people to the fact that maybe having wood chips as part of your landscaping isn't the best idea.
Yeah.
Maybe there's other ways of landscaping.
Yeah. That's what the whole idea of FireSmart is and FireWise, right? Is just minimizing, don't have cedar shake, don't have, you go with stucco and tin or whatever, and then you have
building codes,
right? Yeah. And keeping your firewood away from the house and away from the shed, you keep it under whatever, right? Like you just minimize the opportunity for sparks to. I think people have a misconception thinking that if a fire is going to burn down my house, it's going to be the flames licking my house that's going to catch fire. Where they don't realize that it's mostly just embers landing and catching, right? Yeah. And that once you realize that, you start looking at your yard totally differently, and you go, oh, well, that's an issue, that's an issue, that's an issue, and you start to think about those types of things. And I think it just requires a more aware people, right?
Yeah, so, and maybe just certain regulations that are put in place by a county or municipality. Mm-hmm. People are horrified by this concept, but when you look at places, drought-stricken places like almost anywhere in Texas, you go to the city of San Antonio, and what Texans are like is that you don't mess with my individual rights. Everybody there pretty much is bought into the ideas that they cannot have these lovely green, lush lawns because there's just not enough water to go around anymore. Yeah. And so the city has in place that if, when we are in red or yellow alert, people have to stop watering either their lawns or their plants. Mm-hmm. And it's forced everybody to move into, planting drought-resistant plants, maybe getting rid of their lawns, or allowing them to go brown during the drought season, simply because the city has essentially said you just can't behave this way anymore.
No.
And I think that to some extent we can move more gently now with landscaping, building codes here. We don't have to have come up with a sledgehammer to try to solve some of the challenges.
Right.
We can gently move people in this direction. Mm-hmm. I mean, how much would it cost the city to, send out leaflets to, and, news reports to everybody living within, say, half a kilometer of the river valley and pointing out that we're in a fire zone.
Yeah.
Here's what you might be able to do. If you've got a cedar shake shingle roof that's in need of replacement, maybe you should start thinking about an alternative.
Yeah.
Because if there's a fire, an ember can travel 2 or 3 kilometers, and if it's on your roof, there's not a lot you're going to be able to do when an ember hits dry cedar.
Cedar, yeah, of course, exactly.
And, or if you're thinking about landscaping, you're building a new house, think about this. I don't see that it would cost the city very much.
No, it's just changing the mindsets. It's yeah. I think
slowly
right.
but surely, just getting people into the idea that, all right, maybe this is the better option, and maybe it's cheaper to put up asphalt shingles as opposed to cedar shakes, and I'm sure it is.
Yeah, they don't look as good, but they're yeah. If it's going to save your home and all your belongings, or possibly pets or whatever, right? Like it's definitely worth the investment for sure.
Yeah. I think we can start doing this, but nobody is really doing it right now, and I think it was, I don't know if Mike Flanagan's been on your show here, but he said it appears that we're going to have several more Fort McMurrays with more lethal consequences before we start really getting government to act in a much more aggressive way.
Yeah, it's tough. I know there's a lot of small organizations kind of driving these messages, right? But you're right. It's not a priority, right? Like it's definitely on the back burner. And I think people in the forest community, like in the forestry community, environmental community, conservation community, they know about these issues, and I think they're aware and they're keeping up on it. But anyone outside of those communities, if you're a teacher, if you're a nurse, if you're not, that's not on your mind, right? So it's a slow and steady progression. I think you're right. I think there needs to be a little bit more investment into advertisement and making the public aware of what they can do and how simple it is that they can help themselves, right? So
yeah, and those options may not be available 10 or 20 years down the road when the fire threat increases, because it's not going to get better.
Not magically, no.
Yeah, I got this. I'm going to the Yukon on Thursday to give a talk on Saturday, and I'm having a number of interviews with people. And one of the things that some people came back to me with is that the climate models show that we're actually going to get wetter, and we're going to be okay. Well, all right, but how much wetter? Is that for every 1 degree increase in Celsius, you're living in the fastest warming place on Earth, you're going to need 15% more rainfall to compensate. You're also going to get more lightning, which more triggers. You're probably going to have more people, and I guess the other other explanation that are well aware about is that after about 10 days of it could rain cats and dogs for all of June and a good part of July, and after 10 days, the forest doesn't really have any of really intense heat. The forest doesn't have much memory of all that wet weather.
It takes a few hours for the fine fuels to dry out, right? So
so it could get wetter, but we can also because we know that the jet stream is now holding weather, for a longer period of time. This waviness that's taking place is not dragging weather across from west to east as quickly as it used to. And that's why, we had the Calgary flood in 2012. It sat there and it just kept, and then, the snow melt came off and everything combined. We've seen record rainfalls, right across the prairies in places where it's normally dry, over a 10-day or 10-hour or 12-hour period where there's no record of that kind of rain occurring.
No, it's every time, like I said, every time you turn on the news, every time you look at a paper, it's pretty insurmountable at this point that people have to start admitting that climate change is happening. It's here. We're going to see more extreme weather, and the results of that we need to start thinking about. It's incredible that all these things that it's funny how it all comes down to education in the end, right? You have to inform the public, and it's such a crazy problem that you have to try and solve, to try and teach the public about it. But that's the true with everything, right? With mental health, with any number of issues that you come down to, it always comes down to we need to inform the public. And coming up with the solution to that problem, it just always seems difficult. But I think you painted a really, really comprehensive picture here, and it's although there is a lot of concerns, and it seems to only be getting worse, and there's it's only going to get more extreme as time goes on. I think you painted an excellent picture in pointing out that we have the capacity to do the research and to figure this out if we just have to start doing it. And not to say that we aren't doing it, but there needs to be more investment into it. And I found it was really, really good. It wasn't a doom and gloom book. It was very comprehensive. All kinds of things that popped up into my mind that I never ever would have thought about. If you have do you have any final thoughts regarding your book, or regarding fire, regarding climate change, any of this?
I guess that one thing, if I could wrote the book again, that I probably do less of is to try to demonize fire as much as maybe I did in the book, because there is a lot of beneficial things that come from fire. I mean, it's a natural process. I did in a few chapters outline this. It's not always a catastrophic impact on the environment. That fire is something that we have to live with, like we live with extreme weather and all and every other form. It's just that we're going to have to find ways of being able to live with it without it really hurting us.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the problem right now. It's just that we still don't consider fire as a form of weather the way we consider avalanches, tsunamis, tornadoes, and hurricanes. We treat them much more seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. Changing the culture. Just starting to understand a little bit better. Yeah. No, exactly. I couldn't agree more. Awesome. Well, this is a perfect conversation. I think we kind of got through the main issues I wanted to get to. There's so much more in there. I mean, honestly, I wasn't sure what I was going to get with this, if it was going to be kind of dumbed down to, people who are completely unaware, or if there was, but realistically, you did an excellent job. I think anyone that doesn't understand fire, up to people who have a career in fire, can get something out of this book and can really understand and increase their knowledge, right?
So you made my day.
Yeah, I think you did a perfect job with the jargon. Just kept it down to a minimum and just explained everything well. So
great. Thanks.
It was awesome. Yeah, thanks a lot for coming on. If anybody has questions for you, I'll just get them they can email me and I can send them off to you. Yeah. No, I really appreciate you coming on. This is perfect.
Yeah. No, this is good. This is a nice primer for. I've got a whole series of talks that are coming up, and it's getting my brain working again. I've been working on a different project for the last couple of weeks. So.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I wish all the best to you.
Okay.
Thanks again.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for listening, guys. If you guys have any questions for myself or for Edward, you can feel free to contact me at yourforestpodcast@gmail.com or through the Facebook group, Instagram, Twitter, whatever. Shoot me a message. I'll get back to you. If you guys, as soon as this is over, I want you guys to go on, rate, review, and subscribe. Helps me out a lot. Please do it. Thanks a lot, guys. We will see you next time.